Okay, I guess I'll get the ball rolling. I'm Amanda Talley, and I'm going to be doing the overview of the original study and the conclusion. You guys are all supposed to introduce yourselves.
Yeah, sorry, the microphone wasn't turning on. All right. So this is a behavior change project. It's Amanda got it started. I'm Sarah Kegel, and I will be doing the IOA at the treatment integrity and the limitation section. And Kristen.
Okay, I'm Kristen, and I am going to be doing the literature review and some of the methods part.
And I'm Gita, and I'll be doing the purpose and limitation of the study.
And my name is Jessica. I'll be presenting the first half of the literature review and then also my results from the study.
And I'm Christina Wachowski, and I will be doing the methods section of the study.
All right, so the purpose of the original study was to evaluate the effectiveness of an intermittent prize-based reinforcement intervention on increasing physical activity. The study determined physical activity was based on step counts and active minutes. In the original study, 11 participants wore a Fitbit for 3 weeks. During the initial baseline, participants received prize-based reinforcement for just wearing the Fitbit. During the intervention phase, participants had to meet set criteria for daily steps to receive reinforcement. For the second baseline, participants received reinforcement again for just wearing the Fitbit. The results of the intervention showed that 8 participants increased their step counts. 4 participants showed clear treatment effects and showed an increase in an average of 4,387 steps per day, while the other 4 participants showed a modest increase in an average of 2,845 steps per day. Our aim was to replicate the study in terms of design and reinforcement contingencies.
Okay, so to begin, I'm going to go over some general reasons why our study was important and basically talk about the reasons why we should be increasing our physical activity. So to begin, obesity is and has been a growing epidemic in the United States for many years. This is due to 3 reasons. First being larger portion sizes. Oftentimes you go to restaurants or even just serving yourself at home, you tend to serve yourself more than double what you should be eating, even sometimes triple. Additionally, cheap options are more favorable nowadays with the economy, and those cheap options do tend to be a little bit more unhealthy compared to the higher cost, healthier versions. Also, convenience is a huge factor as well. Most Americans come home from work, they don't want to cook, and stopping at a fast food restaurant is much easier than coming home after a long day and cooking a meal. So those all contribute to making it easier to consume a high-fat, low nutritious diet. So when you combine this unhealthy diet with the common sedentary lifestyle that Americans also lead, working desk jobs, also being able to shop online, not having to leave your house as often, your risk for obesity obviously increases. So with this obesity and physical inactivity comes a plethora of health risks. This includes cardiovascular disease, diabetes, hypertension, cancer, even depression. So mental health is also at risk. But all of these risks can be decreased with a simple change in lifestyle. So for the purposes of our study, that would be physical activity. So in order to achieve that healthy lifestyle, you need to lose weight, and we can accomplish this by increasing our physical activity. And a way to do that is by increasing walking or the number of steps that you take per day. So the American College of Sports and Medicine recommends that every adult achieve 10,000 steps a day. Unfortunately, the majority of us are hitting just below 7,500, so we have a little bit of a deficit there. Despite that, walking has been proven to decrease BMI, or body mass index, weight, and as a result, will decrease also the risk factor of those health risks such as cardiovascular disease. And that was concluded by a study conducted by Murphy, Neville, Murtagh, and Holder. So ultimately, this makes walking a great intervention for decreasing obesity. Now we have a good intervention for decreasing obesity, but these results can take months to feel and see, so we have a delayed reinforcement there. So that means we also have the issue of creating that motivating operations or that need for immediate reinforcement. So that's where our problem lies. We have a solution to increasing physical activity, but we need that reinforcement schedule to make sure that the behavior of walking increases and stays elevated so we can get those lasting results. So now Kristen's going to provide a little bit more detail about some current interventions and studies that are available.
Yeah, so as Jessica said, although walking is a very simple task to do, and we as an adults know that it has beneficial to improve physical and mental health, it can be difficult to create that establishing operant to increase that physical activity. So to help us get moving, coming up with a plausible solution was to combine contingency management and walking. So together, the hope would be that they'd create some motivation for reinforcement based on different criteria. While the contingency management can create motivation, there have been some difficulties with like recording data. So the number of steps or active minutes without someone continuously monitoring. So to help save this, to help with this difficulty, then the accelerometers, if I said that right, such as Fitbits and Apple Watches have been used. And they're convenient because they can allow that measurement 24/7 without having to have someone record data. There are many different types, and some of them are very low cost, which makes them very appealing and a favorable choice. A study that was done by Curdy and Dallery showed there's a positive relationship between low cost reinforcement contingencies. The study looked at a total weight loss. So from all the participants that were in the group, those that were receiving reinforcement had higher weight loss than those who did not. So the result basically was, receiving reinforcement would increase your steps as well. And contingencies are completed through the internet, like Jessica said. It helps with it has that convenience. It eliminates the having to travel somewhere to different places, and they can be prompted more people to participate, and results can happen immediately. When looking into reinforcement, positive reinforcement has always been a preferred method versus negative or punishment. Another study by Adams, Hurley, Todd, and colleagues discussed the delivery method of reinforcement. In regards to reinforcer being immediate or delayed, the study claimed that the smaller, more immediate reinforcers help to increase the physical activity over time versus having a delayed reward. The same study claimed that immediate rewards that were paired with adaptive goals, such as like we did, having everything based on the individual, like an individual criteria, they did, those were higher increase in physical activity than those that were maybe just a generic 10,000 steps for everyone.
Okay, this study was aimed at sedentary people because the authors, the researchers believe sedentary people are more at risk of inactivities. So in order to do that, as Kristen has already stated, they try to reinforce them to implement to give them reinforcement to see if that will encourage them and just to do more working activities. Yes, this like it says in the study, for those who received those reinforcement, they did increase the amount of steps they took. Yeah. So now I will turn over to Christina.
Okay, so to begin talking about the methods section, I'm going to speak a little bit about the participants and the setting. So we are all online graduate students enrolled in the ABA Master's Program at Ball State University. There's 6 total students in the study. We have 5 female and 1 male, and we range in age from 23 to 56. So in the original study, they also completed an eligibility questionnaire prior to doing the study. And what that was it eliminated potential participants that indicated they were either not interested in increasing their exercise level, did not have asthma, or were pregnant, and were not aware of any reasons that they should avoid physical activity. So as a group, we discussed this questionnaire, and it was determined that none of our participants fell under any of those specified categories. Moving on to materials, there was 4 main materials that we did use. The first one, of course, an accelerometer, and we used Fitbits and Apple Watches. And this was just based on what we had access to. So some of us already owned one of these watches, and then others of us were able to borrow one from either a friend or a family member. Various models were acceptable as long as they recorded steps per day and also active minutes. And in regards to the active minutes, the original study was able to access minute-by-minute active data time to calculate inter-response times for IOA. And although we wanted to replicate the study as closely as possible, this was a modification that we had to make due to not having permission from the Fitbit and the Apple companies. So active minutes were still something that we recorded, but we had to adjust how we calculated IOA, and that will be discussed a little bit later in the presentation. We also used an activity guide. This was the exact one from the original study. It was called Be Active Your Way, which was a 28-page guide published by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and it was based on the 2008 physical activity guidelines. So basically, it instructed adults how to increase physical activity levels. The topics discussed in that guide were strategies for initiating and maintaining activity, creating activity goals, explaining intensity of activity, and then also documenting progress. So the guide was given to each participant. However, similar to the original study, the guide was not discussed in detail. We also used an Excel document, and this was through Google Docs, so it was shared among all of our group members. It kept us really organized in terms of recording data, and it clearly outlined our names, each phase of the study and the corresponding dates, and then the number of daily steps, active minutes, and we also included whether or not we would receive reinforcement for that day. A Word document to track reinforcement was the last material that we used. We updated this every day we had a drawing, and we listed the date, the number of prize draws per participant, and then also what reinforcement was earned based on the draw number. The behavior that we were targeting was our daily steps. So as a group, we got together and decided what we would define a step as. And we defined it as any instance of picking up one foot and setting it back on the ground to propel oneself in any direction. So each instance of this counted as one step. Examples were any activity requiring movement of the feet in which the person was standing or in an upright position. So examples of that were walking, running, or dancing. And the non-examples was any movement while stationary. So sitting would be a non-example of that. Moving on to the design, it was an ABA reversal design, which included 3 phases. There was baseline 1, intervention, and then we went back to baseline, which we referred to as baseline 2. So during baseline 1, we took data each day, and reinforcement was provided just for wearing the Fitbit or Apple Watch. Intervention phase, the reinforcement was contingent on meeting the daily criteria, which was calculated based on stable baseline data. And then baseline 2, again, reinforcement was earned for simply wearing the Fitbit or the Apple Watch. And then just to recap, data collection, data was collected by means of a Fitbit or an Apple Watch, which tracked daily steps. And at the end of each day, all participants were responsible for transferring their daily step count to the shared Excel document in order to receive reinforcement for each prize draw. So I'm going to pass things along to Kristen, who's going to discuss the prize draws and then our phases in further detail.
Yeah, so with the prize draws, since we all live in different areas, we had looked into doing like an app or something that would kind of pick select prizes, but we had decided it might be easier for just one of us to do the drawing. So what we did, I created 100 different cards, and 50 of those cards had just plain old praise, like in the original study. And then we had a portion that were Target and a portion that were Amazon, and those were all 1. In the original study, they were higher, but just due to it being a lot of money and we used our own money, we just had it at $1. And then there was 1 gift card that was a $5 one, so that was our $100 card. So like Christina said, the criteria during each phase was different. And every time that we completed a prize draw, which was about every 2 days through Google Hangouts, what I would do is I would find out how many draws everybody had. And then one of the members of the group would do like a live video chat with me so they could see me drawing. And then I could also show them the card to verify what was on it. And then everything that was on the card was also verified and then put on a sheet that we were all able to look at. The treatment and baseline, which was kind of talked about already, we started baseline at the same time for everybody. And we went until each individual met stability. And we had the stability was like about 5 consecutive days that would range anywhere from 2,500 steps or less between the highest and the lowest. Following baseline, we started our treatment. Everyone's treatment was 7 days. And then how we figured out the criteria for our treatment is we took the last 7 days of our baseline. We took the highest and ranked it from highest to lowest. And then the 5th one, so the 5th highest, was what we used for criteria. Did I say it? I'm not sure if I said that right. The 5th one, so it'd be like the 3rd highest, my bad. So treatment lasted for 7 days, and then we went back into that baseline again, and we continued draws until everybody had completed all of theirs. So next is Sarah.
All right. Yes, had to unmute my microphone. All right. Moving on. I'm going to be discussing IOA for this study. And we kind of really had to modify it considering, we were long distance and we were trying to find the best route to take. So for our prize draws, obviously we're contingent wearing our Apple Watches or our Fitbit devices, and then meeting obviously the individual criteria that we just discussed, where it was it could be the 5th or the 6th day, so it was about 85th percentile for intervention. And with ranking each of us, we each had to calculate our own individual percentile. So one way that we did IOA was having each person calculate their own percentile, and then each person would pair up with a partner to check each other's percentiles to ensure that they were getting the correct percentile, and that way it kind of gave us a way of inter-observer agreement based on like the step criteria and the percentile for the study. Another way we calculated IOA was actually tracking active minutes with a timer and with our accelerometer. So if any of us ever engaged in any bout of like consistent physical activity once during each phase of the study, so once during baseline, once during intervention, and then baseline 2. We would start our timer. We would start our active minutes on our watch, and then calculate once our activity was up, we would stop them, and then if they matched, the timer would reflect. Obviously, what was consistent on the timer should be consistent on the accelerometer that we used if it's an accurate depiction. So that also gave us a way to kind of see, oh, I mean, are we agreeing on what it's actually tracking? And then we shared it in an online report. It was a Google Doc. That way everybody could kind of see, taking that screenshot, they would be able to see that we were actually having good inter-observer agreement on the time as well. So that was just one way. Those were just 2 ways that we kind of did IOA for this study. Moving on. Here's some examples of us actually wearing the accelerometer and actually tracking our time. So you can see this was mine individually, where I'd have, this is my workout, so it was 1 hour, 1 minute, 30 seconds, and the timer was very close. It was literally off like 1.2 seconds, and that was because I did have to stop them at different times. So that's where a little of the time kind of was different, but it was a very good indication that they were calculating the correct time. Moving on, I'll also be discussing treatment integrity to ensure fairness and accuracy of the raffle draws. Just like Kristen mentioned, they were held via video chat every 2 to 3 days, and at least one participant of the group had to meet with Kristen when she did the drawing. That way we knew that it was doing it accurately, and then it was being fair across the board based on the amount of reinforcement we were being able to receive. As well, all participants were required to take a photo of themselves wearing the Fitbit or Apple Watch once during each phase of the study. That way, and then upload those screenshots to a cumulative document similar to like the IOA to ensure step totals we were documenting were accurate. We wanted to make sure that our Fitbits and Apple Watches were actually matching the steps that we were putting into that document to make sure that they were also the same and that everybody was actually doing it with integrity. And here's a few examples of some screenshots. This is the Fitbit. So here are the steps for Wednesday, October 5th, and then Thursday, October 5th, sorry. And then this was for Apple Watches, where we have the steps down here at the bottom, as you can see, and then the date over here, and also gave us activity levels as well did the Fitbit. So moving on to the results of the study, now that we've kind of gone over all of the procedures in the method section. This was my personal data representing for me. So for my average steps for baseline, it was ranked around 6,494. For intervention, it was around the 8,000 range, and the baseline change it went back down a little bit to 7,000. So based on like this chart, it did show there was an increase, but if you obviously look at the graph itself, there you couldn't tell much of a functional relationship. It was kind of very varied. I did have lower steps on the weekends, and then it would peak during the week if I was working one-on-one with a client and getting a lot of activity in. And then it would go back down. Same thing for baseline 2. It peaked really high because I was on vacation and out of town. So you can't really, based on this graph, determine a functional relationship, unfortunately. Same thing goes with the range. The range is very varied, obviously, across baseline intervention and baseline 2. So moving on to the next subject, which I will pop on the screen.
Kristen, your mic is muted, so we can't hear you, just so you know.
Thank you. That probably helps. So looking at the graph, my first date was my highest steps out of the whole thing. So that threw my average off a little bit, and my range too. It seems like there's quite a bit based on that one point, that one day. But for baseline, the lower parts of my graph would be more of the weekends, and the lowest one, I was sick one weekend, so I wasn't up much at all, so I barely had any steps. But similar to Sarah, during the week when I was at work, I had an increased amount of steps. Going into intervention, my criteria was to a little over 6,000 steps. So during the intervention, I was more aware of what I needed to get. So I paid more attention and made sure I got my steps. And then back to the baseline, it was just simply wearing it. So I was still more aware. And since I kind of had gotten into that habit of looking and checking my steps, it was something that I was doing more often and was more aware of. In the range, the first baseline is large because of that outliner. And then I would say though, for the intervention, the baseline, I increased some, but overall, I would say similar to Sarah, I don't see a huge change, but I could also see if it was different, and we'll talk about in the limitations to different based on prizes and stuff might have made more motivating for me. But and we can move on to the next one. Geoff, it's yours turn.
Is it my turn?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So I cannot see the graph, but since I have a copy of the Excel in front of me, so I can talk about it. I'm typically an active person. Therefore, it was not difficult for me to see an increase in the average steps. Even so, it was hard for me just to have a stable, to have a stability in my data. So the first one from the baseline, so I got close to that 10,000, 10,000. Can anybody hear me? So I was as close to that 2,000 mark. I set up my criteria to over 10,000, but when I get to intervention, you can see I only hit 10,000 steps only in one day, and for the average for my range, the range went from 46 to 12,000. And then one day when I go to do the second baseline, on one day I had over 18,000 miles, 18,000 steps. And for the other days in that baseline, so I barely reaching out 5,000 and 8,000 steps. So therefore, just like as this study suggested, so it is even for an active person, so it is kind of tough to have an average of 10,000 steps, a day. Okay, come on to the next one.
Okay, so as you can see, looking at my average steps, I also had some outliers in my baseline. My average was a little over 7,000. It took me a little bit longer to gain stability. I, like Sarah and Kristen, also my steps depended on what my client was doing that day. If I had one or more clients, I would have higher steps compared to more indirect work. I would have lower steps. And then as we move into intervention, obviously you can see my steps actually went down. My average decreased during intervention. And then my steps again shot up during baseline as well. I also run during the week as well. So as you can see, I did not have a functional relationship at all. The contingency and the prizes did not affect my steps in a positive direction. And I ended up just having higher steps in my baseline than I did in intervention. And I also didn't have stability. It took a pretty good amount of time for me to reach that. So unfortunately, I was not able to replicate the relationship that the original study had proceeded to find.
Okay, so looking at my graph, the first few, like 5 data points, I was moving. And so you can see these first 2 points, I was moving these days, and then down here I was probably driving, and then it shot back up. And then I haven't really been working, so my average has been lower for the rest of the baseline. And you can see that I did decrease between baseline 1 and intervention by a few hundred steps, but I still did. And I think it was more the commitment of getting the steps than it was the reinforcement. So I did get the criteria for each one, because mine was like 3,500, my goal for the steps. So I did reach that, but I didn't increase between baseline 1 and intervention. And baseline 2, I decreased even further. The reinforcement was just for wearing the Apple Watch in my case, and so it just wasn't enough to influence my steps. So we can move on to Christina.
Okay, so taking a look at my graph, it shows, of course, all 3 phases of the study. It took me 13 days of baseline 1 to finally reach stability. My average was about 6,000 steps, and then it made my criteria for intervention was 6,500 steps. So I did accomplish that 5 out of the 7 days for intervention. That one data point that peaked pretty high, I was out of town, which explains, quite a bit more steps than I typically do in a day. And then at the end of intervention, going into baseline 2, there were a few days that were pretty low step counts. So that caused, my average to be a little bit lower for that phase. But my numbers did increase a little bit into intervention, not by much, just by a couple hundred, and then actually decreased after the withdrawal of the intervention. So next, after seeing all the graphs, Amanda's going to tie everything together for us by discussing the conclusions of our study.
All right. To conclude, all the participants in the study were grad students enrolled at Ball State University through an online ABA program. The study included 6 participants between the ages of 23 and 56. Each participant wore a Fitbit or Apple Watch. The study used an ABA reversal design that included 3 phases: baseline 1, intervention, and baseline 2. One thing you'll notice when reviewing the graphs is that all the participants had differing phase lengths. Participants could not move on to the next phase until stability was demonstrated. Stability was determined by having 5 days in a row within a range of 2,500 steps. During the interventions phase of the study, data showed an increase in the steps for 4 out of 6 participants, and baseline 2 showed an increase in steps for half of the participants. Overall, the study aimed to analyze the effects of a prize-based contingency intervention to increase the frequency of daily steps. As the results reflect, 4 of the 6 participants in the study had an increase in their daily average steps following the removal of the intervention. Although there were increases for some participants' averages, it was nowhere near as much as the original study. The original study had an average increase of 3,000 in steps, and our study had an average of a few hundred steps, which is not a significant amount. Our study showed that a prize-based contingency intervention may be effective. However, a functional relationship could not be confirmed based on the data reflected in the graphs. Some limitations may have affected our results, so I'm going to hand that over to Sarah.
All right. Thank you, Amanda. And I will be doing limitations. There were quite a few limitations that I definitely want to discuss that are extremely important to the study as a reason why we might not have obtained the same type of results as the original study. First one, despite all of us living in the same time zone, it was kind of an inconvenience to do daily draws for everybody. We all had conflicting schedules. Everybody had different work schedules. Some people worked really late. So a lot of times it ended up where we were only able to do a prize draw every 2 to 3 days. So that definitely affected access to reinforcement immediately. We only got reinforcement every 2 to 3 days, unlike the original study where it was every day they received it, because they would come in, give them their numbers, and they would get a prize draw that day. So we did not have that capability in our study that we did. Second limitation would be actually the raffle itself. As grad, like Kristen mentioned earlier, as grad students, we know money can be pretty scarce, right? So, and we had to contribute our own money to the study. It wasn't coming from a university. It wasn't coming from the people that were holding the study. We had to contribute. Now, there was that part where if you put in 10, you might get 20 back, depending on how many prize draws you got. But it wasn't, the prize draws themselves were only $1, and then the biggest one, I think, was $5. So the size of the reinforcement might not have been adequate enough to change the activity of the participants. We talked about that principle of reinforcement, while the size of the reinforcement, it might not have been motivating enough. So moving on to another limitation. Like mentioned earlier, Christina mentioned in the methods section, the original study had to obtain special permission to download the minute-by-minute data of our active minutes for Fitbit and Apple corporations. So then they use that data to calculate those inner response times, which is really good because you'll get to see the amount of downtime and the amount of active time for everybody. This technicality and lack of permission from companies, we weren't able to access that information. So that was definitely a variable that we weren't able to contribute to our study. That out, that could have given us a lot of good information if we were able to include that. It would probably have given us a better idea if intervention was effective based on active minutes. Based on step criteria, we didn't meet those kind of levels, but done the activity levels, we may have gotten more prize draws for that. So moving on, Growth, it's your turn to do the limitations.
Okay, one of the limitations, like we already discussed it over many segments of the presentation, is the fact that we were meeting virtually. We had that study where we were in the same area, and it's like we're meeting, so we could have been more motivated. And then the other limitations I'd say also is the fact that that reinforcement for that raffle, that money, that wasn't motivating enough just to do it. Like I've said previously, so we know how important activities we working where we had to work a lot, even in my job, and then it was still tough for me, just like to meet to get the stability to show functional relationship. This is all the limitation I'll add to the study. You can move on.
One final limitation I would like to mention too, that we didn't see, devices that we both used. Some of us used Fitbit, some of us used Apple Watches. So having those different processors tracking data for steps, there could have been inaccuracies in data collection. The Fitbit may have been more accurate, the Apple Watch may have been more accurate. So in order to determine a true functional relationship based on the data, it probably would have been better if the devices were exactly the same. But considering that's the only thing we had access to, that's what we had to work with when we were doing the replication. So that sums up everything. Here are our references for our study. And that was our replication study.
All right, great job. I have just a couple of thoughts and questions. Can you guys remind me how much the reinforcement was in the original study, just a range even? Obviously a lot higher than what you guys were able to come up with for yourselves, but what was the range of money that they were given in the original study?
Sarah, you did.
Unmute your mic.
Yeah, so there was a huge range in between. So some were 5, some were 10, some were 20, and then they had really big ones in there as well that equaled up to 100.
Okay.
So there was quite a bit more money involved in their raffles than we were able to use in ours.
Yeah. So what do you guys think it would be motivating for you? Do you think, what would it take in order to see a stronger treatment effect?
I mean, definitely having those same reinforcers that they had access to in the original study, because I know for me, I would work a lot harder to get potentially a $20 or more gift card than just a $1 gift card. So definitely the, amount of money in the gift cards definitely plays a role.
And if it's not our money, it's not reinforcing too.
Yeah, definitely. Our money went into it, so it may have been motivating to get your $10 back, but I mean, much more than that. It didn't really phase us as much as, the original study with bigger reinforcement options would have been.
I was also wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about what you think the role of self-monitoring was. If just tracking your steps and entering it, starting in baseline, had any type of treatment effect for you. Because I know from personal experience, and then just kind of hearing other people's experience too, and thinking about how like fitness apps are marketed, a lot of people get an Apple Watch or get a Fitbit, and they're usually highly motivated because now all of a sudden you're like tracking your steps, and in your case you were reporting it to each other. So did you feel like your data reflected that it was a baseline, or do you feel like that wasn't a variable?
Yeah, I would say that for sure starting to wear it, because I hadn't worn it for quite some time, I started to be more aware. The Fitbit that I borrowed from a friend didn't show the numbers, so it was just the dots. So then I'd check it on my phone more often just to kind of see where I was at, especially more during the criteria phase when I knew I had a certain number. But just wearing it and knowing that, I started checking it more. And now that we're done, I haven't worn it. And, and I joke with one of my colleagues, her Fitbit died, and I said, well, you might as well not walk because it doesn't count because you're not calculating your steps. So, having those numbers too, I think can be motivating too, as well as what the others were saying with the prizes were a little bit different, and it was someone else paying us versus using our own money. Maybe if we put more of our own money, we'd be more motivated to work harder to get the money back. So that might have been an option, kind of like a gambling situation. You might get it back, you might not. So
I also think, I know like with a lot of the Fitbit apps and the Apple Watch apps, you can share your step totals with friends, and they have challenges just to see who can get the most amount of steps. So I know in the beginning of my baseline, my steps shot up a great amount. So that could have been due in part of just sharing my step totals with other people and wanting to have a higher step count than I normally would. So that definitely could have contributed to it as well.
Great. One last kind of thought that I had throughout the presentation, and as we're talking now, I think maybe it was Kristen or Jessica when you guys were talking about your lit review, and just kind of the role of reinforcement and the preference for reinforcement in interventions. But I think with this, I would be curious to know like the effect of punishment or negative reinforcement in this type of intervention. So I run a lot for as a hobby, and I know like for me, what is motivating is that I'll sign up for a race, and if I don't train for it, then it is extremely miserable. And so my like motivation to train is just to avoid that punishment of these 13 miles are going to be completely miserable if I don't, get going right now. And then I know just kind of I have one of my old professors, she would often put herself on punishment plans for like weight loss or work plans of if she didn't meet her goal for that week, then she would require herself to contribute to an anti-charity. So donate money to a charity that she was like morally opposed to. And so in behavior analysis, like, don't get me wrong, most of us work in clinical settings, work with kids with autism. Like, of course, you want to start with reinforcement, and we're ethically obligated to do that. But like punishment and negative reinforcement, it does work. So I guess I was just wondering if any of you had thought about that or had any reactions to that.
I know I definitely thought about that because I've done that before with like water intake, because I've done another study when I was an undergrad where we did like increasing our, some type of self-management behavior. So I did water intake. So I would do it where like, if I did reach a certain criteria, I would go and like get to buy myself something, and if I didn't meet that level, obviously for that week, I wouldn't, go out with, go out to dinner with a friend, or if I wouldn't meet that certain level, I wouldn't go to the store. So I have had that like punish part before on studies. Typically now when I think of the punishment for me, because I try to work out pretty regularly just to keep up with my kids. So if I'm not active and if I'm not keeping going, I can definitely tell, like based on health wise, that it's definitely harder to keep up with my kids. Mm-hmm. So I definitely think that's a little bit of punishment too, because I feel like really gross when I don't do it. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely kind of a double there, where it's reinforcement and kind of punishment together. Mm-hmm. So it definitely works for me. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Any
I would like to follow up on what Sarah said, since you're talking about reinforcement as benefits of health. That's the way I look at it too, is positive. I told my eyes doctor, he said I was doing good. Typically for men like me, at my age, a lot of them have been wearing glasses for years. I'm just wearing over-the-counter glasses. And I told him, yes, if I'm going to be blessed to be an old man, I don't want to be a miserable one. That's why I try my best to stay active, knowing this is the positive reinforcement. As I get older, hopefully I'll be healthier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So good that, that's kind of the part of health and reinforcement, that there's not the delayed reward. We don't get the immediate access to reinforcement. So yeah. All right, well, I don't have any other questions. You guys did a nice job. So just go ahead and post your video to the discussion board that you're assigned to and submit it on Blackboard, and I will get your grade in then.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Good night.